Exception. Exception is an unexpected situation which interrupts the program execution. Example of exceptions. Example of exception include dividing number by 0, accessing invalid array index, opening file that does not exist, and memory exhausted. Types of exception. Types of exception include check exception, uncheck exception, and errors. Check exception include SQL exception, IO exception, class not found exception. Uncheck exception include null pointer exception, arithmetic exception, illegal state exception, and errors. Errors are usually a situation which occur outside our application, include virtual machine error, out of memory error. Let's see exception. Start with check exception. In a situation where we are looking a file using a file reader class and the file does not exist, so we may encounter exception, and if we have exception handler, using exception handler we will print a user-friendly message. And let me give example. We're using file reader file equal to new file reader. Here we will pass the address of the file and in a string. Let me just pass source / my file. So this is a check exception. Here we have exception. It is showing us that there is exception to handle. Because it is check exception, it's also called a compile time exception. Before we run the application, it will indicate that we have exception to handle, and to handle this exception we can use try and then try catch. Here we pass the class, exception class. Let's say IO exception, and then give it a variable. This is like a variable where we can access the members of the IO exception class. Using this, we can access, there is a print stack trace, which is if we have any exception, we will have this class executed. And if to say that this file is not exist, we will have exception. This the print stack trace give the detailed about the exception that we will print that we have. Now let's run this program and see. Now here is the stack trace that it gives detailed about the exception that we have. So we can also print something here if the file does not exist, like SOUT file does not exist. Let's print run. here we have file does not exist. Whenever we have a problem here, we are when we did not find the file, this block of code will execute. That is why it is catching the error or when we have a problem. And if we do not have the problem, we will not have this execute. Let's create an address like this, source my file here, and see if we will have this file does not exist again. In this source, let me create a file and let the name of the file be my file as written there. Now that we create my file, let it just be text. Okay, I will not write anything here, just it is an example. Let me try running this program again. Since that we have my file here, so let's see if this block of code will execute or not. Let's run the program. You see we have nothing here because the file exists. If the file does not exist, we will have this line printed that the file does not exist. Now since the file exists, we won't have any problem. Let's print something at the end of these. SOUT trap like let print success here. Here we have just the line after the exception, this line. Okay, now that we have this line, this is check exception, and the next we are going to look is uncheck exception. Before we go to uncheck exception, there is something we can do here. Imagine this file exists like this one that we created here. We have to close this file using file dot close like this, but this is not the good way of closing the file. We use finally block to close the file, because once the file exists in this line, it will jump, or if the file does not exist, it will jump from here to this line, and if the file exists, it will just go to the other code that we have, if to say that we have code here. So to close this file, let me define, here we have exception demo. Let me create file reader. Here we have file reader, and let's call this exception demo equal to new exception demo, and then set this exception demo dot file reader to this. Now what we will do next is use finally block. In this finally block, we will use this exception demo dot, here we have file reader dot close. So now here we have exception that we have to handle, which is IO exception. To handle this exception, we will put this in a try catch block. Try and then catch IO exception. Print stack trace. This is how we close the file easily, but this code is too many. I use this code because if we want to set the variable, like to say file reader here, file reader, and we will have file reader. The problem we will face is here. We will have a problem unless if we set this to null. And this is the easy way of doing or to close the file using finally block, not the one that I showed earlier. Let's check uncheck exception. Uncheck exception. Let's try giving an example of uncheck exception. Int number 1 equal to 0. Int number 2 equal to 1, and then int result equal to number 2 divided by number 1. Let's print result and see. Here we have divide by 0, because here we are trying to divide 1 by 0, which is this is on runtime exception. We will not have a compiler indicate an error here because it is a runtime exception. It happened in a runtime. So what the solution is that we avoid using such programming errors. Mostly an uncheck exception happens because of the programming errors. Example, if we're trying to access index that does not exist, if we have an array of 3 and we then try to access the 4 index, then we will have an error. This is uncheck exception, and later we are going to look on throwing exception on using a method Now that we see how uncheck exception works, let's show how we use a exception on method signature to tell the user of the method that he have an exception to handle. Now let's have public a method like this, public void checker, and let's have parameter string check, and inside this method let's said that if the value that we have here is not equal to yes, then we have to throw an exception. If check equals yes, and then we have to if check is not equal to yes, then let's use an IO exception here. Throw IO exception, and there is new here, new IO exception. So, and it is telling us, the compiler is telling us that there is unhandled exception, but imagine that we don't want to use the exception here. We want the user of this method to handle the exception. Then we will use throw IO exception like this. And if we use throws IO exception in this, let's delete this. In this main class, let's use var exception demo, exception demo equal to new exception demo like this, and let's access the exception demo dot the method checker yes, string no. So here we have this method is telling us that there is unhandled exception, and this happened because here we use a IO exception here to throw an exception that the user of this method will handle. So now it is telling us we have to handle this exception. Okay, using this, let's surround this method and let's print this and see. Okay, now we have Java IO exception, which is from this class exception demo and on line 9. Okay, now let's set it to yes and see if the program works fine. It worked fine. Okay, this is how we use exception on method to tell the user of the method that he has an exception to handle. Okay, now next we will build a custom exception and use this exception on the same method that we have in this class. Now to build a custom exception, let me create a class, new class, and have this checker. The name of the class is checker, and the super class of exception is throwable, which the base class include the base class is throwable, which the child class include exception and error. Now let's extend exception here, and in this exception, now that we extend this exception, we will let's generate constructor. Now we will have constructor with a parameter, and there is a constructor without parameter. Here is the argument that we have here, and I want to use the constructor with this parameter message so that we can use this parameter to write our exception, custom exception. Okay, now that we create this public checker string message, this message that we will pass when we are using this checker. Now let's change this to checker, and we have to pass a message here, and we will change this to checker also. Let's have a message like the argument supposed to be yes. Okay, now that we have this, let's go to our main class. We will have checker here. So now let's print a message soute get message. That is, we will use this to print the message that we have here in our parameter using the get message. Okay, if check is not equal to yes, we will have this. Okay, let's go to main class. Let's set it to check to no, and let's print and see what we have so far. The argument supposed to be yes, we have. Okay, and we can also remove the parameter if we don't want to use a custom message. Okay, so here we will have an error because now that we are not using the okay, let's print it again and see. Here the message is null because we did not define the message. Okay, this is about exception we cover in this lecture. You can subscribe to our channel for more on Java and other programming languages as well.